You've probably heard the advice: try harder, reach out more, don't let the relationship drift. And you're following it. You send the message. You check in. You choose your words carefully. You tell yourself you're being patient. But somehow, the more effort you put in, the more distant things feel. That's the part that rarely gets explained clearly. Because what you're doing looks loving from the outside. It looks like what a good parent is supposed to do. Stay available. Keep the door open. Refuse to let silence win. But relationships aren't shaped by intention alone. They're shaped by impact. When your child is no longer a child, your attempts to close the distance can land very differently than you expect. What feels like care to you can feel like pressure to them. What feels like repair can feel like control. What reads to you as love can register to them as being managed. That doesn't make you the villain or them ungrateful. It means something in the relationship has shifted. And if you keep responding to that shift with the same instinct, you may be widening the gap without realizing it. A lot of parents get caught here because the emotional logic seems obvious. If something is breaking, you repair it. If someone pulls away, you move closer. If the connection feels thin, you invest more effort. That logic works in most areas of life, in work, in practical problems, even with young children. But with an adult child, the equation changes. Because now there are two distinct realities in the room. Yours sounds like, something feels wrong, and I need to address it before it gets worse. Theirs may sound more like, every time my parent senses distance, they come toward me harder. More questions, more explanations, more checking. I don't feel closer. I feel like there's less room to breathe. That's where the confusion sets in. You think you're protecting the relationship. They experience the relationship as something they need protection from. And once that dynamic is in place, both people tend to misread what's happening. You see withdrawal and interpret it as a need for more reassurance, more contact, more effort. They see more effort and experience it as confirmation that being themselves around you carries emotional consequences. So they pull back further. You feel the pullback and try again. This is why it can feel like the harder you try, the worse it gets. Not because effort is always wrong, because effort driven by fear has a different emotional quality. It carries a demand inside it. Call me back. Explain yourself. Tell me what changed. Reassure me. Let me know we're okay. You may never say those words, but the other person can feel them. Adult children are particularly attuned to that feeling because adulthood changes what closeness means. When they were younger, closeness often meant access, guidance, involvement, correction. Now closeness has to coexist with autonomy. Many parents understand that intellectually, but struggle with it emotionally. You can say, I know they're an adult now, while still responding, as though closeness gives you a certain claim, a right to ask, to know, to interpret silence, to keep pushing until the tension resolves. When that assumption is no longer shared, every gesture toward connection starts producing friction instead. This is where a lot of common advice goes wrong. You've probably heard, communicate more, keep reaching out, make sure they know you care. Reasonable on its face. But in practice, it often means keep doing what may already be overwhelming them, just with a softer tone. That's why so many parents end up exhausted and confused. They're following guidance that assumes more contact automatically produces more connection. It doesn't. Sometimes more contact means more exposure to the exact dynamic that's straining the relationship. More reminders, more emotional decoding, more attempts to return things to how they once felt. And here's something harder to sit with. Sometimes trying to fix the relationship isn't really about the relationship. It's about what the distance is doing to you. It's making you anxious. It's making you feel rejected. It's forcing you to question what kind of parent you were, to sit with uncertainty, to face the fact that your child has an inner life you can no longer influence. So you move toward fixing. not only because you want connection, but because you want relief. That's human. But when your child senses that your contact is carrying your need for reassurance, your need to settle the emotional atmosphere, they often feel burdened rather than reached. Because the interaction is no longer only about them, it's also about regulating you. And that's where many adult children start to feel something they can't quite name. Not always, my parent is controlling. Something subtler. They feel watched, anticipated. They feel that a delayed reply will become a topic, that a boundary will be read as rejection, that their mood and tone and choices are being scanned for meaning. So they start simplifying contact, shorter messages, less detail, longer gaps, safer conversations, less honesty. From the parent's side, this feels devastating. You notice they don't share things the way they used to. Conversations stay shallow. When you ask what's wrong, you get nothing or I'm just busy. And because you can feel something is off, you try to go deeper. But deeper is no longer a place they experience as safe. This is why trying harder can fail so completely. You're responding to reduced openness with increased pursuit. And pursuit tends to make reduced openness worse. Not because your child doesn't care, but because space is now part of how they maintain a sense of themselves. That's especially true in relationships where closeness was never just closeness, where it also involved emotional merging. You felt what they felt. They felt responsible for what you felt. Boundaries felt cold. Separation felt personal. In that kind of dynamic, adulthood isn't just a life stage. It's a disruption. The child is trying to become a separate person inside a relationship that may have trained them to stay fused. So when you try to repair things, they may hear something underneath the words, "Come back into alignment with me. Stop being so separate. Make this feel familiar again." Not because you consciously want that, but relationships communicate on more than one level, and people respond to what's implied as much as to what's said. This is why your child may pull away even when your words are kind. The words aren't the whole message. The urgency is the message. The inability to leave tension alone is the message. The repeated reaching is the message. You may experience it as "I'm just trying to repair this." They may experience it as "I'm still not allowed to have distance without managing my parents' reaction." Once you see that, a lot of confusing moments start to make sense. Why ordinary conversations turn tense, why small limits produce outsized reactions, why they seem warmer precisely when you stop pushing, why your most sincere efforts leave you feeling shut out. It's not always about what you said. Sometimes it's about the fact that the whole interaction was organized around closing the gap too quickly. And forced closeness rarely feels like closeness. It feels like pressure with a kind expression on it. There's another layer to this. If your sense of identity has been built around being needed, being the one who holds relationships together, then distance from your adult child doesn't just hurt. It destabilizes. Now, it's not only, why aren't we as close anymore? It becomes, who am I if I can't reach them the way I used to? Who am I if my effort no longer works? Parenting gives structure to your emotional life for years, sometimes decades. You know your role. You know how to act when something feels wrong. Then adulthood changes the terms, but no one explains it clearly. They just say, stay loving, stay available, keep trying. When that fails, you either blame yourself or blame them. But the more precise truth is usually this: you're responding to a new phase of the relationship with an old model of closeness. And that model may have worked before, which is what makes this so disorienting. You're not necessarily repeating something that was obviously harmful. Sometimes you're repeating what used to feel like love. But adulthood reveals the cost of certain kinds of closeness. It shows where care became overreach, where involvement became intrusion, where emotional openness quietly became expectation, where being close came to mean being emotionally accessible on demand. When your adult child begins resisting that, you can read it as rejection, or you can read it as information Information that the relationship can't be repaired through more pursuit. That your child may need a different emotional climate, not a stronger version of the same one. That good intentions are no longer sufficient on their own. The shift that becomes possible here isn't stop caring or go cold or never reach out. It's smaller than that and harder. Stop trying to force resolution. Stop using contact to manage your own anxiety. Stop treating distance as an emergency that demands immediate correction. Stop assuming that love has to arrive as effort the other person can feel. Sometimes love has to arrive as less pressure, less urgency, less need to settle things right now. That kind of restraint can feel passive when you're used to earning closeness through action. But restraint isn't indifference. Sometimes it's the first indication that you're beginning to see the other person as separate from your own fear. And that may be where a different kind of relationship becomes possible. Not the old one. Not the one where effort reliably restored closeness, where your role guaranteed access. Something less certain than that. Something with more space in it. Something where you're no longer trying to hold the bond together by pulling it tighter. Because that's sometimes exactly what breaks it. And this is the part that's hardest to sit with. You may have been trying to save the relationship with the very behavior that made your child need distance in the first place. Not because your love wasn't real, because your love still carried an expectation they could feel. An expectation to respond, to reassure, to make your effort pay off. Once you see that, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I try harder? It becomes, what happens if I stop making closeness the immediate goal? What happens if you stop treating every silence as something that needs to be fixed? What happens if you let the relationship show you what it can actually hold, rather than insisting it resemble what it used to be? That's not giving up. It may be the first time you're relating to your adult child as they actually are now, rather than reaching toward who they were. Maybe what you called fixing was, in part, a refusal to let the relationship change. Maybe the distance isn't always punishment. Maybe sometimes it's the shape a relationship takes when one person is trying to become fully separate, and the other hasn't yet learned how to love them there.